So I think family came out of the Cultural Revolution, importance of family. And that is one of the problems in today's China, that family and increasing the wealth of the family, especially in the upper levels of the party, is a major problem.
And indeed, Mao had identified this as a problem, that families were in effect feudal structures, which sort of distracted people from the great proletarian undertaking of building the nation.
Yeah, and I remember a very sardonic newspaper editor, Chinese newspaper editor, said to me, "Thank you very much, you Americans, for the Korean War because you killed Mao's son. And if you hadn't done that, we'd be just like North Korea, and we'd have a Mao in charge of the country now."
Instead, we almost got his wife.
Yeah, right.
No, the Chinese would never have allowed a woman to take over.
Yeah. Well, they have had a few cases.
Yes, and they've been excoriated by historians down the ages.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. You know, where are the women in the Chinese Communist Revolution and one might say counter-revolution?
Yeah, and you've been closer to them than I have.
Well, they've been killing British businessmen, I think. No, I mean, it almost fits in too perfectly that the arch villain in the saga is a woman.
A dragon
right?
lady.
Yeah, dragon lady, sort of slightly psychotic. And there's been a steady stream of character assassination rumors about her depraved lifestyle. And sort of the best you can say for her is that she might have bone cancer, and this might explain everything. But other than that, it's she's just crazy. And then Bo sort of ends up being an accessory to murder because he tried to cover up for his wife. But what husband wouldn't with such a wife? So, you know, he sort of comes off looking like the okay guy almost in the way they're trying to sell this. Although we haven't got the official story yet, but this is the way it's sort of coming out.
Hard to imagine him as a victim of anybody, including a wife on the rampage.
No, because he was clearly didn't have a close relationship with his wife. But no, I think you don't see very many women at the top in China, and there is a chance that there'll be one in the new standing committee. And would that be the first time ever, or?
They've had them
I
in the
don't
Politburo.
think
They've
there's
had them
ever
in the
been.
Politburo, but never as high as that.
Never in the standing committee. Yeah. So.
No, according to Mao, the women hold up half the sky, but just so long as they're not seen.
Yeah. Well, in fact, they do hold up half the sky. I mean, anybody who knows China at all realizes that women are an incredible driving force, both within the family and also at other levels. I mean, while the men sit around drinking tea, it's often the women who are really running the place.
Well, that's a problem because, of course, they'll drink tea and then no one will be running the place because they have killed off too many girl babies.
All right. you want to comment, Ian?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think the main problem facing, but there is a problem not just in women, but you see it in all sorts of participation, that you have a very homogenous group running the country, and although China has 55 or is it 56 minorities, ethnic groups at least, you don't see any really in any significant positions of power, and this is of course another problem that the country faces.
Actually, under Mao, they had a Uyghur and a Mongol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
They don't do that now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if we sort of look at what's going on, you've both alluded indirectly to this sort of crisis of values and belief system, and you suggested, Ian, there was a hunger for some sort of spiritual value. I mean, it used to be a question that was pretty neatly answered at home and in politics by Confucianism and Buddhism. If you, wanted to exercise your spiritual side. What's happening now, and what might we expect in terms of this part of their self-reinvention?
Well, I think it's very difficult because a lot of identity was also local, and people obviously lived in villages. They had a village identity, and worshipped communally. And now with this incredible urbanization that's going on, you have a huge amount of alienation as well. People don't really feel a part of any system. It's not only political, but I think they don't know who's in charge of even their families. And there's been some powerful work done on this, especially that documentary film that came out a couple of years ago about the, was it Last Train Home, I think, that shows the incredible social fragmentation that's going on, and fragmentation of families. And I think if you live in Beijing, you quickly find people who are in this very difficult situation of moving to the city, not having any infrastructure, nothing to bind them. The lack of civil society there really comes through. There's nothing like a YMCA or those sort of things. The party infrastructure is almost non-existent. So the only people who are really active out on the streets are the Chengguan, the sort of urban management teams, but they're widely hated by the people that they're supposed to be sort of looking out for. They look out for them only in a police sense, that they don't.
Don't you still have groups living together who are from somewhere else, like the Wenzhou area in Beijing?
Yeah, you do have a bit of that, although they continually try to knock these places down. But people usually come to a city because they know somebody else there from their hometown or their village. And again, it gets back to what you're saying about the importance of family. These are the only, or clan, they're the only people you can count on. But that doesn't create a really cohesive society or a cohesive sense of nation. It creates small, very siloed individual lives. And a sense of social spirit is often lacking. Chinese people talk about it all the time. So I think it's one of the reasons you see a growth in alternative education as well. Parents who are sending their kids to, if they can afford it, of course, but Montessori, Waldorf schools. These are all growing exponentially because they think this creates a sense of cooperation rather than a zero-sum game mentality, which is predominant in society.
Ironically, a value which, even in its sort of cryptic form during the Cultural Revolution, was very much inculcated into every level of society, a kind of a service equality, even though class struggle was
class struggle outweighed service.
Service, I think serve the people was a genuine motto before the Cultural Revolution, even during the time of the famine, though many local officials protected their families rather than the villagers who were under their control. But serve the people meant something then. And I think what has happened is that the morality of the Communist Party was destroyed by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. And the party comes out of that, individuals thinking, well, you know, if that's the way they treat me, I'm going to go for myself and my family.
Yeah, retreat to the lowest common denominator of society.
Exactly.
So let's turn for a minute. Let's see, what time is it? I want to take plenty of time for questions. But I want to talk a little bit about China's sort of perception of itself in the world. And this very deep concern and fixation now on how it's presented, and of desiring to figure out how do you get, as if you could just get, soft power. So first of all, let me ask you, what do you both sort of think is behind this tremendously strong concern about China's image abroad that we now see?
Well, I think that the Chinese feel that the kind of achievement that they have genuinely made over the last 3 decades, the kind of size they occupy within the world scene, both economically and population-wise and so on, should result in a better image of China in the outside world. And they don't quite understand why that isn't so. And they think that soft power, which has become a mantra, you know, At one point, there was an academic almost every month coming and saying, now, tell me about soft power. How can we do that?
How can we get some?
Yeah. And a feeling that this is something the state can do by the creation of Confucius Institute. They don't realize that the only way you can get soft power is by having a vibrant civil society which throws off ideas and music and drama and all sorts of things which people abroad look at and say, great, we want to copy that. We want to do that. American popular music has now become Taiwanese popular music. Taiwanese popular music has swept the mainland. You know, that kind of soft power is something which they just haven't managed because they don't like the idea of society getting out of control.
And yet, Rod, I have to say that I have two sons in 20-year-old range, both who speak Chinese. And when they go to China, I mean, I get a little window into what is an incredibly vibrant sort of youth scene.
culture.
Now, maybe not the deepest culture in the universe, but it's really vibrant. It's a kind of soft power. There is hardly anybody of that age who wouldn't have fun in Beijing or Shanghai today. So how are they missing that? Why are they?
Well, they're not projecting it.
Yeah.
Because you could ask the audience how many of them know about this vibrant youth culture in China. You assume that youth are vibrant anywhere.
Well,
Because we're certainly not.
But I think that China's civil society has to grow up and it has to produce things which civil societies elsewhere recognize and wish to copy. I mean, your sons may come back as ambassadors for this youth culture, who knows?
I thought it was really telling, though, that I just read yesterday or the day before that Stan Lee, the creator of Spider-Man and some other comic heroes, he's now created interestingly enough, a guy who gets his superpower from Qigong, which I thought was a sort of rehabilitation of, but he's called the Annihilator. And China's like, we've got Stan Lee on our side, but he's created somebody called the Annihilator.
and Superman, when he first came onto the scene, was he was really peace-loving, no violence, nobody ever died.
Yeah.
I mean, he was quite, how shall I put it, even a little effete by today's standards. Interesting.
So the Annihilator is another way of calling him Terminator.
Yes, yeah. But there's this idea that you can sort of just get somebody to make a superhero for you, and then this will be.
So where does China have real soft power?
I think, in fact, what we all realize, though we don't think of it this way, is that if a country has hard power, people will be interested in its culture and what makes it tick. And why, long before the Confucius Institute became the latest instrument of Chinese propaganda, many people in this country were starting to learn Chinese at quite a young age. Schools across the country were beginning to teach Chinese at a very young age. And I think that's because China was rising, and this is very impressive, and so you want to know what makes them tick, and one way you do that is by learning the language. So hard power is an essential ingredient of soft power. There are probably some wonderful smaller countries without much hard power, but also have wonderful soft power, but we don't know about it.
And you see them all in Beijing. There's an incredible array of cultural centers, and every country is trying to project its image into China, probably for economic reasons, but also the idea that this is the country of tomorrow, and we want to count, and don't forget,
But this is a little bit counterintuitive, isn't it? You both have described a country sort of on the verge of various kinds of breakdown, and yet, Ian, here you're saying everybody wants to go to China.
Ferment. I think it's ferment. It's a country in ferment, and a lot of things percolating up from below. You can see signs of, yes, a social dislocation and protests and riots and stuff like that, but you also see a lot of vibrancy, and there isn't really too much contradiction there. In the party's mind, perhaps there's contradiction, because they want only the good, the clean. They don't want any of the messiness that comes with a real vibrant society, but they're getting it. In terms of soft power, you can see it here, all the people who have come to this talk. There's a huge amount of sympathy and interest in China. around the United States and in countries around China, all the efforts by foundations to find Chinese, to come and study, to take photographs, to do this and to do that. I mean, they're just, foundations are almost scouring China for candidates, and I think that also shows that China is on the rise. But the party wants to control this and lead it. And we saw that, I think, decades ago with, if you wanted to, and I'm not sure if this is absolutely true, but for a while there was an effort in the 1980s, if you wanted to have an academic exchange program with China, you had to use Chinese textbooks, and they wanted universities to use simplified characters, for example. But
I don't think actually either of us used the word breakdown. I think the situation is, what you've got to remember about politics is that inertia is the most powerful force in it. And that China, as it is at the moment, will continue as it is at the moment, with growing problems that we know about and which an economist among us could expatiate at, an ecologist could tell us more. But unless there is some traumatic development, because Chinese history in the last 150 years has progressed through trauma. 3 great changes have been as a result of trauma. Unless there is a traumatic development, people will get a little bit richer, riches will spread a little further, people will still be rioting in their local villages when things go wrong. But inertia is very powerful.
Okay, well, before we start, some questions from you all. You're describing a kind of muddle along scenario from here.
If I were in the Politburo Standing Committee, I would devoutly want to muddle along.
Yes, well, I think they do devoutly want to. But the question is, will they be allowed to have another decade of kind of just peaceful evolution?
Well, if you can think of a trauma.
Well, sometimes you don't need to think of them. I mean, the world is replete with these things that just spring up out of nowhere.
Well,
are you optimistic that the next 10 years will be ones where we'll have this sort of piecemeal, lots of problems, but things cohere and move forward? That's the subject of our panel tonight.
You came here from California where there's the San Andreas Fault.
Yes.
Everyone says it's going to blow, but no one says when.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I don't know when the trauma is going to take place.
I take your point, but that implies that there is some instability aloft.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Ian, how about you?
I think a lot of economists, it's almost become a truism when you talk to people in China, they'll say the next 10 years of reforms, just economic reforms, forget the political reforms, are as important as the past 30 years. And there are so many things that really need to be tackled. But this runs up against, here we do get into politics. You need to break the state's monopoly over so many industries and so many areas of life. There's about a dozen key industries where the state has declared that it will have either a monopolistic position or some sort of a leading position, which crowds out private enterprise. When you think of a dozen industries, and we're talking about really the key industries in the country, that begins to be a real problem. And most Chinese economists you talk to at universities and think tanks, they all agree that this is an issue, but you don't really see any kind of a program. If I compare it to the 15th Party Congress, we're coming up to the 18th Party Congress. So 15 years ago, when I was in Beijing with the Wall Street Journal, around this time before the Congress, there was a clear plan by Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji to, zhuo da fang xiao, to grasp the big companies and release the small state-owned enterprises. That was a bold plan of reform that's led China into the WTO. And this is already being talked about, because when these things are afoot in China, it's not a secret that's going to be unveiled on October the 20th or whenever the thing ends. People are talking about it. There are working groups. There are thousands of people who know this. And right now, you don't hear anything like that at all. It could happen. It could be that Xi Jinping is just really playing his cards really, really well and doesn't want to scare anyone, or it might not happen until next year at the National People's Congress. But you don't get a sense that there is any kind of a, I don't want to say visionary, but there's any kind of a bold step that's about to happen.
I think the one name we haven't mentioned is being Gorbachev. the Chinese leadership, sorry?
Don't mention Gorbachev.
The Chinese leadership have had films, they've had professors talking to them, and they've discussed Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union endlessly. And what did Gorbachev do? He took a risk. He couldn't get the state apparatus to change. So he launched a mini-cultural revolution. He launched people to attack the bureaucracy in the newspapers, intellectually. And the last thing they want to do is to take a risky endeavor like that. No one wants to be the Gorbachev of China. Liu Shaoqi was sadly named the Khrushchev of China by Mao Zedong. No one wants to be the Gorbachev because that's the end of the Chinese Communist Party.
All right, before, let me just quickly ask both of you, how do you think our relationship with China is going to evolve? Where do you think it is now, and what can we expect this coming year? This is a very important bilateral relationship.
Well, the United States has done quite a bit to ensure that its relationship with Xi Jinping would be good. Frank, Joe Biden has said, but good. And every attempt was made in this very torturous negotiations about the blind lawyer Chen in order to save China's face in a situation which almost was impossible to save face. Yeah. So I think that Xi Jinping ought to feel that the United States wants to work with him. Now, whether circumstances turn out in a way that that proves more difficult than at present seems possible, we don't know. But I think that relationships should be good for the transition.
Yeah?
Yeah, I agree. I think it will carry forward fairly smoothly, but there are always these issues that crop up every few years, and China is just an example of one that you can't predict. And this one went off relatively smoothly. Both sides are probably pretty happy with how it went off, but there could be something else that happens as well that we just can't imagine. And those could be hard to negotiate if something happens. If the Chen case happens, let's say, in late October or early November before the election, it could have ended up a bit differently, perhaps. So.
Okay, so let's hear from you all. There will be microphones, so raise your hand. Let's see, right here. Raise your hand and then we'll bring it to you.
I don't know where to start. You've raised so many wonderful questions. One that I'd like to have at least tossed around is the migration problem, which China seems to have a gridlock in migration that's even worse than the United States, because we're dealing with people who are nominally Chinese and they can't even move to a city and integrate into the city the way Americans take for granted. The second issue is the relationship between the national and the local government that was brought up earlier. This seems to be China is supposed to be a unitary state, and yet they don't. If anything goes wrong, it gets blamed at the local level. This seems to, after a while, build up and kind of point back to say there's people up there that may be controlling things. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'll handle I'll talk about the migration. Yeah, there's a huge amount of migration going on. I think at the end of last year, for the first time in Chinese history, a majority of people lived in cities as opposed to the countryside. And I remember at the beginning of my Chinese studies, the ratio was always sort of 80-20. People always said 80% countryside, 20% cities. So there's been a huge shift that's gone on. But so the party wants to control this, and Beijing now only has, I don't know, 18 million people or something, but not 100 million people, because they're trying to create these catchment cities. And you see urbanization going on at the very local level, where county seats are being turned into cities, and then they're building a huge number of apartment blocks. And then villages are being torn down often and just replaced by a couple of apartment blocks. You can just fit everyone in the village in these blocks. And as these cities grow, they want that land. So that's another reason why they tear down the village, build an apartment block, and it becomes a suburb of the city and eventually a district of the city. But this leads to huge tensions, and I think the town that everyone was looking at earlier this year, or last year, Wuhan in Guangdong province, is an example of that. It was a real estate deal, essentially, that everyone objected to, how the communal property was being sold off, and again, with no input by people. So the urbanization is happening, the party is trying to control it, but the way they are controlling it, again, leads to a feeling of arbitrary control over people's lives and to discontent. And a lot of it depends on the locality, of course, how well it's carried off. But this is, I'm sure, behind these 180,000 protests every year, I bet 100,000 at least have to do with real estate deals in Chinese cities.
And they do have, at the moment, they have the policy of the new socialist countryside, which involves a lot of money, and it's supposed to benefit the peasantry. But one way that local officials feel they can use the money best, and it shows them off, is by building these towns you've just described. Tearing down the villages and decanting people out of their old houses, many of which probably they may be glad to be out of, into an apartment, which has no connection to the land at all. Now, I was listening to him so closely, I forgot the second question which I'm supposed to answer.
You spoke earlier about the relationship between...
Oh yes, center and the localities. I think if a local official wants one day to be a contender, wants to be a member of the Central Committee, perhaps even higher, then that person is going to be very careful about his or her actions over the course of their career. But if your attitude as a local official is, I'm never going to get up to Beijing, I'm never going to be a member of the Central Committee, I'm going to have a good life for my family. There are really two criteria that the central government hands down. One is develop. And the other is keep law and order. In other words, I said earlier, just make sure they don't damn well phone the Wall Street Journal or wherever Ian Johnson's reporting from at that particular time. And unless, as I said earlier, unless the center is irritated because something has hit the world's press, and goodness knows, you know these people, how quickly they're able to communicate with Western journalists and get their story out. As long as that doesn't happen, well, the center it's got its general policy, the outcomes are up to you down there. And so in that sense, it's not the tight totalitarian state that seemed to be the case in the Maoist era.
Okay, next question, right here on the edge.
You both seem to indicate that what the Chinese leadership would want to have is 10 more years of quiet development and very stable, non-confrontational relationships with other parts of the world. Whereas if you listen to the pronouncements from at least some of the speeches from the People's Liberation Army, they are much more assertive in their view about what Chinese role ought to be, both in South China Sea as well as in other parts of the world. Do you see a scenario whereby the Chinese People's Liberation Army in fact becomes a larger force in the upcoming years, given the wealth and power they have amassed, and therefore, rather than this quiet 10 years that you are projecting, it will be much more tumultuous and next 10, 15, 20 years based on their own image of what their destiny should be in terms of power.
Ian's probably met some of these people, but I'm told that these bellicose generals are, in fact, retired people who like to get their faces on television and to be popular and to state nationalistic aims in a rather belligerent manner is apparently one way to get yourself popular, because